The secret invisible rain that obliterated 20,000 German troops in just 8 days. A dramatic way to put it, and one we'll use as our guide. But let's be clear from the start, that figure describes an elite spearhead of roughly 20,000 men whose cohesion and fighting ability were shattered in little more than a week. By the end, the 12th SS Panzer Division and attached units had been rendered combat ineffective, suffering close to half their strength as casualties or losses under a sudden, top-secret shift in artillery technology. This is the story of how a tiny radio in the nose of an artillery shell turned foxholes into death traps, and how one guarded innovation rewrote the rules on a frozen European ridge in December 1944. December 14, 1944. A map of the Ardennes looks innocent enough. Folds of forest, narrow lanes, ridges that rise like dark teeth from the snow. Hitler's high command issues an impossible order. Sepp Dietrich, commander of a formation that included the 12th SS Panzer Division, is told to drive northwest and seize Antwerp within days. Antwerp stands as a prize, seaborne lifeline for the Allies. To the German high command, capturing it could sever supply lines and force a political decapitation of the Allied front. To Dietrich, it is an instruction straight out of desperation: go and do it quickly. Dietrich's force is impressive on paper. Tanks, including heavy Tiger and King Jaeger variants, veteran panzer crews, and fanatical infantry elements bolstered by Hitler Youth recruits. Morale among many German units is high in its own perverse way. Fanaticism can substitute for logistics, at least for a while. But the motor of modern war is not courage alone. The Ardennes offers immediate friction. Roads that thread through deep forests and narrow passes, clogged with supply columns and immobilized vehicles. Fuel that is rationed to the point of tactical immobility, and an unforgiving winter that turns mud into ice. Even King Tigers, magnificent and heavily armored, have limited range and gobble fuel. One operational truth emerges fast. Without roads and gas, even the best tanks are simply heavy statues. On the Allied side stands the 99th Infantry Division, an American unit labeled green by some, but disciplined. They occupy the Elsenborn Ridge, a narrow, defensible expanse that controls the approaches through the forest. When the German assault begins in earnest on December 16, the initial impacts look promising for the attackers. Fog and low clouds blanket the Ardennes. Allied air support, the hammer that often broke German massed attacks, is grounded. For a brief window, the skies are neutralized. Germans push. Units of Hitler Youth, young, reckless, trained to close with bayonet and flamethrower, press forward. Armored columns attempt to find lanes through choke points, and the 12th SS sees early gains. But there is a more subtle factor at work long before any secret weapon appears: artillery physics. Winter changes the way shells behave. Impact fuses, designed to detonate on contact or after a brief delay, now bury into frozen ground and snow rather than exploding cleanly above it. When they detonate inside compacted earth, blast energy dissipates laterally and downward into the ground. Shrapnel loses lethal momentum. Foxholes that would normally provide life-saving cover become tragically effective shelters against the conventional airburst. The shell buries and the earth absorbs the blast. That subtlety matters. A defender who knows how to use reverse slope positions and to maintain disciplined depth-based defenses can blunt a numerical advantage. The Americans display exactly that discipline. They fall back in measured stages, digging in, trading space for time, and using terrain to blunt armor. For 7 days, December 16th through the 23rd, the battle becomes a grind. German tanks and infantry push. American artillery and small unit cohesion hold. Casualties mount on both sides. Supply columns clog the roads and become targets themselves. Ammunition and fuel are precious and rationed. The Germans cannot funnel all their forces through narrow, icy lanes at once without creating congested massing points, places where
concentrations of men and vehicles sit tightly bunched, vulnerable in ways they may not realize. That very vulnerability, however, is invisible to the naked eye until someone spots it. On December 23rd, as fog begins to thin, a forward observer on a ridge looks west and sees it. Dense knots of German forces close together, preparing for a massed movement. Radios crackle, coordinates are given. The observer transmits the usual call for supporting fire, but he appends a single guarded code word, VT. That two-letter code is the key. It is not a magic incantation. It is a trigger on an institutional decision, an authorization to use a top-secret fuse that will behave very differently from the ones that have been used up to that point. Before we follow what happens next, it's worth explaining exactly what this VT fuse is and how it turns the physics of the battlefield upside down. The explanation is simple in concept and elegant in design, and it comes down to 3 steps. First, the design. Unlike an impact fuse that detonates after contact or a timed fuse that counts down, the VT or proximity fuse contains a miniature radio transceiver and its own power source. Engineers at institutions like the Johns Hopkins Applied Physics Laboratory and other wartime research centers worked to miniaturize components and ruggedize them for the extreme forces of artillery firing. The electronics fit into the nose of the shell, sealed and robust enough to survive muzzle blast. That small radio is the brain of the system. Second, the sensing principle. The fuse doesn't need complex computing. It relies on the Doppler effect, the same phenomenon you hear when an ambulance siren changes pitch as it passes. The shell's radio broadcasts and listens. Reflections from the ground and nearby objects shift in frequency as the shell approaches. The fuse detects that change and thus estimates relative motion and, critically, distance. When the reflected signal indicates the shell is at the correct altitude above the target, the fuse triggers. It's a little like an invisible hand telling the shell, now. Third, the effect. Instead of burying itself in frozen soil and losing destructive potential, the shell detonates in the air, roughly 30 feet above the ground. From that height, the blast produces a downward cone of high-velocity fragments, distributing lethal energy across a wider area and at angles that sump into foxholes and trenches that had been shelters before. The result is a shower or invisible rain of metal splinters raining down, reaching into positions where the deadliest part of the blast is not a concussion, but the downward torrent of shrapnel. One should emphasize 2 things about the VT. It was not infallible, and it was heavily guarded. Concerns about capture and reverse engineering led Allied commanders to restrict its use. Order to employ the fuse was deliberate and often required high-level authorization. Eisenhower and his staff recognized both its power and its potential long-term cost if examples fell into enemy hands. So when a forward observer adds VT to a call for fire, it is the result of a calculation, an authorization to use one of the most sensitive munitions in the Allied arsenal. Supply columns that were already clogged become smoking wrecks when a single mortar or artillery battery concentrates VT salvos on the gap in the convoy. Command and control collapses not in an instant but over hours, an accelerating cascade where one disabled node removes situational awareness from others. This was not theoretical. The 12th SS Panzer Division felt it immediately. Units that had been advancing in density now found their ranks shredded. Within hours, whole formations that had been central to the offensive were cut down to fractions of their previous strength. Where a company had been an instrument of attack, it became a hollowed-out congregation of wounded, dead, and stunned survivors. Tanks stripped of infantry screens and suffering equipment and crew losses were abandoned or destroyed in swamps and roadside ditches. The cumulative effect across the division was catastrophic for German operational goals. The spearhead lost momentum, coordination evaporated, and the drive toward Antwerp stalled. Here it's critical to be precise and honest about numbers. Contemporary reports and later historiography agree on the scale of the disaster without supporting sensational totals of total annihilation. The division and its attached forces numbered roughly 20,000 in the sector. Over the 8 days of intense fighting, the Germans suffered heavy casualties and losses that left the division close to half of its effective strength. That is a staggering attrition rate for so short a period, and one that, in the context of the Ardennes offensive, was functionally equivalent to obliteration. The unit could not be reconstituted quickly. Vehicles lost in the forest could not be repaired or recovered at the required pace. The supply lines to replace men, fuel, and ammunition were simply not available. In military terms, the formation was no longer the spear that Hitler had sent forward. The tactical picture was matched by a strategic understanding at the highest level. Eisenhower's decision to guard the fuse's existence was not made lightly. The calculus was harsh, but clear. Reveal the fuse and risk the enemy developing countermeasures or copying the technology. Withhold it and accept both the ethical weight of concentrated lethality and the chance to blunt a potentially decisive German breakthrough. In this case, the Allies judged that the immediate operational necessity outweighed other concerns. Protected use of the fuse in the Ardennes demonstrated the raw power of industrial innovation combined with battlefield discipline. It's tempting to interpret this as a simple moral about machines versus men. The truth is more complicated. The soldiers on either side were human beings making the best decisions they could under the circumstances. Commanders attempting to leverage terrain and doctrine, small unit leaders improvising under fire, engineers and scientists building solutions in workshops far from the forest.
Technology did not negate bravery. It changed the environment within which bravery could and did exist. A brave assault into massed formations that had been survivable under one set of physical laws could become suicidal the moment those laws were altered by engineering. The secrecy around the VT fuse also had ethical dimensions that deserve attention. Keeping such a weapon secret risks appearing to commodify surprise at the cost of human life. Yet, during World War II, secrecy was part of the broader logic of total war, an effort to prevent technological surprise and to protect the intellectual capital of months or years of research. The people who designed the fuse, including teams at Johns Hopkins and other research labs, worked with an awareness that their invention would be used in a lethal context. Military leaders weighed that against the potential to save far greater numbers of lives by terminating an offensive quickly. These were tragic but rational choices inside the moral gray of wartime decision-making. Another lesson from this episode is the decisive role of logistics and terrain. Dietrich had tanks and fanatical infantry, but he lacked the hoses of fuel and the arteries of clear roadways to feed them. Mechanical power without effective sustainment is a hollow promise. Winter weather, clogged roads, and supply shortages all conspired to limit German operational tempo long before any fuse was fired.
The VT fuse exploited the German tendency, forced by circumstance, towards massing in narrow corridors. In a different operational environment, the same fuse might not have been as transformational. It was the intersection of constraint and innovation that produced the outcome. There are also technical caveats to bear in mind. The VT fuse was a leap forward, but it was not without problems. Early electronic components were temperamental. Extreme acceleration from firing could damage the system in some rounds, and environmental factors could interfere with optimal detonation. Commanders knew this, which is why authorization to use VT was measured and why supply of such munitions was carefully controlled. The weapon worked reliably enough to change the course of the engagement on Elsenborn Ridge, but it was neither a silver bullet nor omnipotent. As the offensive stalls, other elements of Allied strategy begin to assert themselves. Patton's Third Army was maneuvered to plug gaps and counterattack elsewhere. Reserves are shifted. Air support begins to reassert dominance as cloud cover lifts more broadly. Industrial capacity, the capacity to produce not only munitions but replacements and fuel, remains the deepest advantage the Allies hold. Germany, stretched thin and fighting on multiple fronts, cannot replace the losses in man and material at the same speed. The failure to capture Antwerp within the brief window Hitler demanded becomes, in the broader calculus, another nail in the offensive's coffin. The human dimension lingers.
For German soldiers, many of whom were young conscripts or ideological recruits, the experience was traumatizing. Units that had been cohesive were broken, and survivors shuffled back into lines that had fewer officers, less ammunition, and little in the way of supplies. For American defenders, the success of the VT-assisted fires was both tactical salvation and a stark reminder of the changing nature of war. Men who had dug foxholes and relied on cover suddenly understood that the physical rules of protection had changed. The moral weight of using a weapon that so thoroughly undermined traditional notions of shelter and defense was not lost on commanders and chaplains. Yet, in the brutal arithmetic of 1944, the immediate need to halt a breakthrough weighed heavily in decision-making. When the smoke cleared in late December, the Ardennes offensive had failed to achieve its grand objectives. The 12th SS Panzer Division's spearhead crumpled under the combined force of defensive discipline, logistical shortages, and the innovative application of an air-burst fuse. Losses, personnel and material, were severe enough to prevent the Germans from renewing the drive with the required vigor. The offensive would soon be hemorrhaging momentum on other axes as well, and the broader strategic picture shifted irrevocably in favor of the Allies. There is a lesson that echoes beyond the pine-lined ridges of the Ardennes. In modern war, advantage often accrues to those who can couple industrial capacity with the liberty to innovate. Courage and doctrine define the possibilities of the human actor, but technology can reshape the domain in which those actors operate. That is not a moral judgment of machines over men. It is a sober observation about how conflicts are decided when one side can feel the disruptive technology and preserve its secrecy long enough for it to be decisive. One radio call, one two-letter code, VT, was enough to shift the accent of combat on a ridge in December. What had been a tactical stalemate twisted into a localized rout. The invisible rain did not literally annihilate every man in the sector, but it did what mattered most in military terms. It ended the division's capacity to function as the spear it had been intended to be. For Hitler's timetable and Dietrich's mission, that loss equaled failure. In the aftermath, the reverberations were both practical and symbolic. The Allies learned how to leverage emerging technologies under strict control. The Germans were left to pick through wreckage and to wonder, in military terms, how so much could have gone wrong so quickly.
Historians today still debate details and percentages. Exact casualty figures remain the subject of archival work and careful qualification, but the strategic bottom line is hard to dispute. A guarded technological innovation delivered in the right place and moment can determine outcomes as surely as massed divisions and brave assaults.